I've been sitting on this story for years. Decades, actually. It's one of those things that burrows into your brain and just stays there. You don't talk about it because it doesn't make sense. It doesn't fit into the world as you understand it. But it happened. I was there. And now I think it's time to tell it. This isn't just my story, it's my father's story. Or maybe it's the story of something else entirely. Something that doesn't have a name. Something that doesn't belong here. I grew up in a small town in the middle of nowhere. You know the type. One gas station, a diner that's been there since the 50s, and a whole lot of empty fields. My family lived in an old farmhouse about a mile outside of town. It was the kind of place where the nights were so dark you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. No street lights, no neighbours, just the occasional sound of coyotes howling in the distance. My dad was a quiet man. He wasn't the type to tell stories or joke around. He worked hard, came home, ate dinner and went to bed. But there was one night that changed everything. I was about 8 years old at the time. It was late summer, and the air was thick with the smell of cut grass and damp earth. I remember it like it was yesterday. It started with a knock on the door. We were all in the living room, my mom, my older sister, and me. Dad was in his chair, reading the newspaper like he always did after dinner. The knock was loud and sudden, like whoever was on the other side wasn't used to waiting. Dad looked up, frowned and set the paper down. "Who the hell is that at this hour?" he muttered. It was past 9 p.m. and we weren't expecting anyone. Dad got up and went to the door. I followed him, curious. When he opened it, there was no one there, just the porch light flickering and the sound of crickets chirping in the distance. "Hello?" Dad called out, stepping onto the porch. He looked around, but there was no one, just the empty yard and the dark outline of the barn in the distance. "Probably just kids messing around," he said, coming back inside. But I could tell he was uneasy. His shoulders were tense, and he kept glancing out the window as he sat back down. About an hour later, Mom realized we were out of milk. She asked Dad if he could run into town to grab some. He grumbled about it, but agreed. He grabbed his keys and headed out the door. I remember watching him walk to the truck, the headlights cutting through the darkness as he drove off. That was the last time I ever saw my father as the man he was. He was gone for about an hour. When he came back, something was off. He walked into the house slowly, like he was in a daze. His face was pale, and his hands were shaking. He set the milk on the counter and just stood there, staring at nothing. "John," Mom said, looking up from her book, "you okay?" Dad didn't answer. He just kept staring, his mouth slightly open like he was trying to say something but couldn't. "John?" Mom said again, louder this time. Dad blinked and looked at her. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. Just a strange, strangled sound. He tried again, but it was the same. He looked panicked now, his eyes wide and his hands clutching at his throat. "John, what's wrong?" Mom said, standing up. She grabbed his arm, but he pulled away and stumbled into the living room. He sat down in his chair and just stared, like he was seeing something none of us could see. We didn't know what to do. Mom tried to get him to talk, but he just shook his head and made those awful, guttural sounds. Finally, she called the doctor. He came over, checked Dad out, and said there was nothing physically wrong with him. No stroke, no injury, nothing. He suggested it might be some kind of psychological shock and told us to keep an eye on him. That night, I lay in bed listening to my parents' voices downstairs. Mom was trying to get Dad to tell her what happened, but he just kept making those sounds. Eventually, she gave up and went to bed. The next morning, Dad seemed a little better. He was still pale and shaky, but he was able to gesture and nod. Mom made breakfast, and we all sat down at the table. Dad picked at his food, his eyes darting around the room like he was expecting something to happen. "John," Mom said gently, "can you tell us what happened last night?" Dad looked at her, and for a moment, it seemed like he was going to speak. He opened his mouth, and we all leaned forward, waiting. But then his face twisted, and he let out a strangled cry. He grabbed his throat and shook his head, tears streaming down his face. "It's okay," Mom said, reaching for his hand. "You don't have to talk about it." But Dad wasn't having it. He stood up suddenly, knocking his chair over, and pointed toward the door. He made a series of frantic gestures, trying to tell us something, but none of us could understand him. He kept pointing and gesturing, his face growing red with frustration. Finally, he stopped. He looked at each of us, his eyes filled with something I can only describe as terror. Then he sat back down and buried his face in his hands. That was the last time my father ever tried to speak. For the rest of his life, he was mute. He could still hear and understand everything, but he couldn't say a word. He went to doctors, specialists, even a psychiatrist, but no one could figure out what was wrong with him. It was like something had stolen his voice. Over the years, I tried to piece together what happened that night. I asked him once, when I was a teenager, if he could write it down. He shook his head and looked away, his hands trembling. It was the only time I ever saw him cry. He died when I was in my 30s. Natural causes, the doctor said, just old age. But I always wondered if whatever he saw that night had something to do with it. If it had taken more than just his voice. I've thought about that night a lot over the years. What could he have seen? What could have been so terrible that it took his voice away? I've gone over every detail, every possibility, but I still don't have an answer. All I know is this: that night, something came to our house, something that didn't belong here. And whatever it was, it didn't want us to know about it. I still live in that old farmhouse. My wife thinks I'm crazy for staying here, but I can't leave. Not yet. Every now and then, I'll hear a knock on the door late at night. I'll open it, and there'll be no one there. Just the porch light flickering and the sound of crickets chirping in the distance. And sometimes, when I'm lying in bed, I'll hear something outside. A sound that doesn't belong. A sound that makes my skin crawl. I'll get up and look out the window, but there's never anything there. Just the darkness. And the feeling that something is watching me. So that's my story. Or my father's story. Or whatever it is. I don't know if it's scary or just sad. Maybe it's both. All I know is that it's real, and it's something I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. Thanks for listening. I just needed to tell someone.